Are the slides up? Yeah, here they are. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. I come here as what I would say, a hybrid of a pastor with some years of experience, but also as a church consultant that has been observing a lot of different church movements, networks, and especially missional churches across the continent of Europe and the Nordic countries. And Flemming asked me to talk about revitalization of the church in the West. That's what I heard you say to me. So this session, titled Revitalize, reveals a focus on revitalizing the church in the West. How do we navigate change, transition? That will be the first part. And the next thing I would like to discuss with you is how do we embrace innovative practices in our churches? How do we discern what will work in our lives, in our churches, in our ministry situation? The Western world, that is North America, Western Europe, and Australia and New Zealand, is the one exception to the norm in the world today. In total, our churches are not growing, but declining. What do we do in a situation of serious membership decline, where church-going is no longer the accepted norm? Maybe it never was, but it was at least accepted. We seem to be in a hostile or non-interested environment, in spite of some breakthroughs. Can the church at large be revitalized across Europe? That's something I have on my heart. Many mainline free churches or former majority churches, they operate in a context of confusion, anxiety, resistance, loss. And however, God is on the move. That's obvious. God is alive. He's doing great stuff, like we just heard in Odense. There are some islands of health and strength in our countries, also in Europe. Churches that are to some degree or effectively reaching out to their culture. But the sad thing is, there are also whole countries and regions in Europe where we are seeing no spiritual breakthroughs. There's a huge harvest out there. I did some research some years ago in order to identify church planting churches and bring them together in a learning community. And I think I found at least 17 countries in Europe where that was not the case. They were not to be found. Maybe there was one or two churches that had been planted, but we didn't see movements of church plants. So I think a new missional era has dawned in Europe. I'm convinced of that. I think we have a huge task ahead of us. So the question I would like to ask this morning, what kind of leadership is required in our day? What kind of leaders do we need to be? That's a big question. I don't know where you find yourself in your situation, whether you're stuck, feel confused, depressed, if that's your situation, or whether you are thriving, you feel you're spiritually fruitful, you're confident, you're experiencing a personal flow in your ministry and your mission like never before. I don't know if you are thriving or striving. Whatever you experience, it's not just about you personally. Don't take it personally. That may give you hope, or it might combat your ego. But there's a lot of factors in mission, like cultural context, type of congregation, your team, divine intervention, outpouring of the Spirit, a lot of factors. It's more than you. So what situation are you in? Try to evaluate that carefully. How do you experience yourself as a leader in your current situation today? Are you thriving or striving? And if you are thriving, How can you accelerate what you're doing? How can you diffuse what you're doing? How can you strengthen weaker congregations and leaders that are confused? If you're striving or stuck, how can you revitalize your congregation? I would like to first turn to our cultural climate, the climate that we operate in, our context first. And I'm sure as seasoned and experienced leaders, I would say nothing new about our culture. I just want to raise our awareness of the situation that we're in. And after that, I'll return to the leadership question and where we all are, personally or as congregations. The culture we find ourselves in is like a big ocean. It determines us in many ways. It affects us. And up until 1968, when the Paris students went on the streets and we had this kind of youth revolt, until that time, the Christian church in the West operated in a very stable and predictable environment. But from that point on, in around 68, our Western societies became increasingly fragmented. They became multicultural, multi-religious, and all kind of subcultural groupings, some of them very eccentric and weird, of all kinds emerged. And eventually, we turned postmodern around 1980. A postmodernity characterized by a very high relativism of values and truth, and the Christian ethos, the Christian story, is no longer known or affirmed. And this situation has profound consequences for the way people in our culture perceive religion and spirituality in the West. Relativism has made most people in the West assume that religions like Christianity and Buddhism and Hinduism, they all have a mystical core. And people think that these main religions, because they all have some mystical core, some experience, deep emotional experience in them, that they are all quite similar, despite their outer differences. And that all religions somehow share an identical religious mystic experience of the divine at its very core. And this perception, this way of viewing religion, is basically what we call a Gnostic position. That means no one religion can claim absolute truth today. We all have direct access to the divine, and to experience the divine, just sit down and meditate and connect with your inner core, which in essence is divine. That's the spiritual people. The technical people who are not interested in religion think that technical ability will solve the crisis of the world. And both of these two solutions, technical ability, science, and spirituality, as I just described it, are acceptable. But as soon as you say that Jesus is the King, as soon as you pray, thy kingdom come, as soon as you say that Jesus is the only mediator between you and God and the fullness in God, you become controversial. You seem to be intolerant. You seem to be aggressive. Can you follow me? Yes. Religious truth today has turned mystical in this sense. Hence our suspicion of institutional religion and our appreciation of personal spirituality. The only thing not tolerated is to assert exclusive truth in the realm of religion. That's one thing. And I'll give you some concrete examples later. What does this mean on a practical level when you meet people relationally? Another thing, we are in the era of globalization. Any culture is everywhere. Cheaper travel, high-speed internet, social media, migration of all peoples. It means that we have maybe 180 different languages in this city. And all these factors have highly increased the spread of ideas and trends on a global scale. We can identify a phenomenon called democratization of knowledge. Democratization of knowledge. We don't keep knowledge in institutions any longer. We spread it in all channels. Lots of top-end universities right now, like MIT and Stanford in the US and other Western universities, they actually put out all their knowledge on the internet. They offer free online courses. You can't graduate. You don't get the diploma, but you can have access to knowledge. And I saw, if you click on some of these courses on engineering or business administration, hundreds of thousands of young people from underdeveloped countries sign up for these courses from Africa and all over the place, and don't get the diploma, but they have access to knowledge. So this is what we call democratization of knowledge. That's one thing. We'll come back to that. The postmoderns have ethics, and it's an ethic of absolute tolerance, of powerless relationships, egalitarianism. It's about democratization of knowledge and equal participation. It's about flat power structures. And that has made traditional, institutional, or organized approach to religion suspicious to many. I think personally Jesus would have thrived a lot in a postmodern culture. He would swim in it and be quite effective, very effective. The religious and cultural landscape has changed radically. Everyone has become both a producer, an expert, and a consumer of spirituality. People behave like that. Let me illustrate this. Just 3 weeks ago, a young anthropologist, he is around 30 years of age, came to my Easter service. He was well-read, well-traveled, I found out later. And he engaged so much with the traditional Easter hymns, the Lutheran Easter hymns. Maybe he knew them from his childhood. I don't know, but I could see he was really, really having a good time. He's not a regular churchgoer, but he was really having a good time on his seat, enjoying these old hymns. So afterwards, I approached him just to have a chat. And he shared deep insights on the nature of religion and spirituality, or rather, how it functions in our lives today. He was a great observer of spirituality and how it functions in our lives. And surprisingly to me, very surprisingly, he had spent 6 months studying the phenomenon of Chinese house churches in Shanghai. And what impressed him the most was the tangible sense of God's presence, and also the powerful, liberating changes that, he said it like this, the Christian God, whenever I meet people that are deeply transformed and have had serious problems, they point to the Christian God. Wow, he could clearly observe it. And there was a tangible presence in these churches. I could sense it. It was thick of a divine presence. And I asked him, why do you think that's the case, that you experienced that in Shanghai? And he said, well, For one thing, they don't have religious professionals that study for 7, 8, 10 years and then make a living of it, whether they believe or not. When you don't have religious professionals running it, you only have authentic believers who are desperate for God. And that invites God's presence, that kind of desperation. You're not in it for the money or the career, but because you're desperate. And he said that as an anthropologist. We learn a lot. We learn a lot. At the same time, however, he was deeply inspired by Buddhist practices. He had an arm brace with some wooden figures on it that helped him meditate 24/7 in order to calm him down and, just being aware and present in his own life. Another woman in the service the Sunday after. At some point in her life, she was desperate and she had some questions about God. And she asked God a specific question. And suddenly, one day, an angel, a huge angel, appeared to her and directed her to a specific church with a specific gospel choir. And the angel said, you can get your questions about God answered in that place. Whoa! I thought angels were something for kids, Christmas time, but really, I did not really, it was not really part of my belief system. I have to admit that. And it made a profound impact on me. Wow. She would call herself a new Christian today, and she definitely is. In another church service, a guy from a suburb, the western suburbs of Copenhagen, turned up. I'm glad I did. I wasn't raised in those suburbs. I won't say more about that. I also grabbed a cup of coffee with this guy. He looked like a skater. He was almost dropping his trousers. Don't dress like that. And he was very annoyed with my preaching because it was too personal for him. You share too much about your experience of God and your stories, he said. And it turned out that he'd come to faith by listening to some hyper-Calvinist teachings on the selection of saints and stuff like that. And he wanted to hear me validate some hardcore Calvinist dogma. That's what he thought Christianity was about. So what I'm saying here is that in this highly irrational, spiritual, complex mosaic, God is on the move. He's doing something despite our cultural relativism. And people acknowledge easily when they meet the real stuff, but they're also confused to some degree. And their conversion may not look anything like ours if we have this kind of evangelical, charismatic, white, middle-class background with pensions and Volvos. And we as pastors and leaders may struggle with some of the spiritual practices or beliefs they seem to keep dear and has some function in their life and make sense and meaning. We as pastors, we acknowledge that our pastoral skills that we were taught, our way of envisioning and strategizing, our planning templates, they don't do for us what they used to do. It's not the whole picture. It's not the whole picture. Maybe we don't know our culture. It's time to listen. And we realize that we are not the only experts in spirituality and healing out there. And we may find it very hard to compete on the market of spiritual goods and services. Sorry to use that expression. The ocean has turned red with blood. There's a lot of sharks out there. They are biting each other. There's a lot of cannibalism going on. And where is the blue ocean, where the sharks are not biting each other? We as pastors, we love to be big sharks and not being bitten by anyone, just being a nice, huge shark who knows everything in a lovely ocean. And it's all for us. And you may kiss my fins. Wow. We love that, and it's no longer so. There's a lot of providers out there, and the ocean is dripping red with blood in the competition. That's how it is in the church world. It's also so in the business world. It's no longer enough to just open the church doors, offer some cool worship, deliver casual talk and a healing prayer. That's too programmatic. We need programs, we need church services, but there's much more to the task of being a church leader today than we were trained to do, than I was trained to do. I have made one decision. I did it 2 days ago. I'm going to read Leslie Newbegin's writings on missions in the West. He came back as a missionary from India and a bishop. And he actually caused the missional church movement in the West, where we're dealing with the question we're dealing with today. What does it take? What kind of leadership does it take to revitalize the church, to see a vibrant, growing missional church in the West? What is it about? And I've realized I have to do a profound study of what it takes. I have to train myself as a missionary. There's so many evangelical charismatic churches. We all have these cool worship services. I just took over a church in deep crisis. We are 35 people in a multicultural area, and no one shows up at the doors. It's time to become missional. I've never felt it like this before, but this is a new chapter. This is a new chapter. How do we as leaders and churches respond to the changed spiritual climate? Do we strive or do we thrive? I think both options are possible for any of us. And I would like to introduce a 3-zone model of missional leadership that will lend us some needed language to help us identify where we are at and why we are where we are. I stole it from the missional church consultant Alan Roxburgh. He hired an organizational psychologist, Romanok, and they wrote a book together. So just stole their model, the 3-zone model of missional leadership. And I reduced a lot of the complexity in it. But you can find it in his book, The Missional Leader by Alan Roxburgh. The 3-zone model of missional leadership illustrates the organizational culture that congregations and denominations form at various times in their life cycles in a stable, simple, predictable cultural environment. We produce leaders with a high capacity, skills, and competences to perform at a very high level within such a stable situation. And we're no longer there. But we term it the performative leadership zone, the blue zone. Membership rates are going up. Problems and challenges are known, but also the solutions to them. You have known problems, known solutions. That means changes are purely technical in their nature. As soon as you have the knowledge and the skills, you can do something about it. It's just about optimizing known solutions to known problems. That's easy. More of the same will produce more of the same great results. So leaders have the capacity, the skills, the competences, the work habits to do what is required, and they thrive and they feel secure in their situation. We call it the performative leadership zone, the blue zone. And for many pastors in the West, and those who trained us, if you ever went to theological seminary, for many of them, most of the 20th century was blue zone environment. But it's no longer so. You do what you used to do, you used to have success, you used to be fruitful, and now it doesn't work any longer. That's so painful. Before I go into that, I would take a step back and ask, what was the foundation laid for performative leadership zone? What came prior to that? Prior to the blue zone, we had the green zone. We had some pioneers. They established what we called the green zone, the emergent zone. In the green zone, we find a culture of maximum innovation and creativity, like we just heard about it in Odense or in Cardiff the other day. It's a green zone. It's emerging. Maximum innovation and creativity. Lots of energy, passion. And you see the birthing of new forms of mission and ministry related directly to the trends, needs, and longings in the cultural context of your mission. You're immersed into it. It's fantastic. It's very organic. It's exciting. In the emergent zone, the fruitful soil, the receptive hearts are clearly identified, and you know how to bridge towards these people. You know how to connect with them. You do it naturally. So a new mission is being built around the very people God has prepared in advance to harvest into his kingdom. It's a period of high experimentation. You learn as you go through failures and successes. You make adaptive changes, not technical changes, but adaptive changes. You don't know what the problem is, you don't know what the solution is, but you're so innovative, experimenting, so you find out what is the problem and what is the solution. You find new solutions. And suddenly, by experimentation and failure, you hit the missional methods and models that really works well for you. Back in the 70s, we had the Jesus People revival, and that culture was a counterculture. It was a life on the street. You could just make a happening. So any hippie Christian from the Jesus People, they could just make some happening in the walking streets of Copenhagen, and they could share the gospel and pray for people. It was very easy. They could immerse into that culture. And suddenly, that stopped. That culture stopped. And you didn't see the same results. That's what I'm talking about. But when you see the results, when it's fruitful, you make a choice. This is what we're going to do on a larger scale. You start a ministry, maybe like YWAM, a Youth with a Mission. This is what we're going to do. We're going to do miming theater. It's a bit ridiculous today, but it actually did work. Or you have these painting boards, because you only had one channel on television, so any missionary coming with a painting board was more interesting for kids in the 70s. Today we laugh at that, but that was fruitful. You have developed a prototype of ministry. It's proven. It's no longer just a great idea or a theory. It's actually working, and doing more of it will just mean that we will increase results. And that means at that point where you make that choice, where you know what you're doing, I can't hear it here. you move into the performative leadership zone again. You know what you're doing, you have set your direction, full speed forward, the winds are in our sails, full steam. But what was created by apostolic leaders, visionary prophets, bold entrepreneurs and risk takers, over maybe 1, 2, 3 decades, it's taken over and run by managers without the same creativity, without the same willingness to take risks. They're not out there. They're inside the model that used to be fruitful. They're inside the model that used to be fruitful. And suddenly, the thriving community they planted has become a cage for the gospel. They're imprisoned, and they don't know how to break out of it. In the business world, they talk about product cycles. Think about Nokia. A lot of innovative products, a whole big industry. They did not believe in the smartphone. We laugh now, but that was a strategic decision. They didn't want to go down that road. They're out in the market. They had 40% of world sales, I'm told. They had all the money, all the equipment. They had all the funding to be highly innovative, more than anyone else. They could invest in just anything. They could invest in the future, and they didn't do it. That's scary. Success is what is blinding us. It leads to hybrids and an unrealistic self-evaluation. If you don't understand the culture and the market, you actually don't understand what you're doing. We might have 50 or 100, 200 or 300 churchgoers, but they may all be disconnected to the culture. You are thriving in your blue zone, performative zone, but as soon as you're outside the cage, you don't know what to do. And I think we need to learn that again. Some of us need to go into this green zone, emergent zone in a radical way. There's a new norm. I call it rapid discontinuous change. Rapid discontinuous change. That is becoming the norm increasingly in all spheres of life, also in church life. And performative leaders without an innovative edge, they will soon find that what used to work no longer works. Maybe not immediately, but over time, you begin to sense it in your stomach. And over a decade, it becomes all too obvious. What might take 150 or 200 years in church history earlier? Think of Methodism. They were highly successful maybe for 200 years. I see movements that have turned irrelevant today in 25 years' time. That's shocking. After 25 years, you're already dying. You enter the crisis zone, the red zone, sometimes before you are even aware of what hit you. And our first natural tendency is to react to this situation by doing more of the same and just doing better. Or come up with a bold, visionary, strategic plan, what we call the BHAGs, a big, hairy, audacious goals. We'll plan 100 new congregations, but the thing is, we can't even run the one we have. 17 people and a dog. I don't know how many church organizations in Europe were called, what are your vision for the future? A lot of them had BHAGs. And I asked them, what do you do now? Where do you see the kind of growth that leads you to conclude that that BHAG is actually based on reality, on your passion and your skills, what you're really capable of doing? And a lot of them were not able. I mean, that's almost insulting. I was maybe not that direct. In the red zone, you either come up, you become uber strategizing, but it's also a time of polarity. This is exactly where church splits happen. Some people are held prisoners by their feelings, confusion, anxiety, stress, anger, sorrow, pain, loss. It's affecting their self-worth and self-identity. And others, they come up with unrealistic BHAGs, big audacious hairy goals in an environment that is already burned out. People have to restore themselves maybe at least for 2 or 3 years before they're able to do anything. When I had my first cup of coffee here this morning, I suddenly realized, that's rather late in life, but I never was hired in any blue zone congregation. They wouldn't let me in. All the congregations that hired me, they were in the high red zone, all of them. So they had to choose between me and death. They love me as much as their doctor or their dentist. And that's such a huge tension, because I don't have very effective pastoral skills, even when I try hard to show empathy. People are offended. Yes. How do you, wounded cats like that, how do you lead them into the emergent zone? It's a time of polarity. It's transition time. And leadership in the transition zone is not first about coming up with these BHAGs that seem very unrealistic to people. They don't believe in BHAGs or strategic planning or anything of that kind. In the transition zone, leadership is about listening. It's about sharing experiences. It's about accepting what is real, not denying reality. And the spiritual discipline is to fuel the imagination. To fuel the imagination by showing people what works in other similar places. And to begin to read scripture and interpreting together what is happening to us as the people of God in the West. We may feel marginalized, exiled in slavery. Well, let's read the portions of scripture that deals with the surrounding culture taking us captive. Egypt, Babylon. What did Ezekiel say? How did Moses lead? Let's listen to the prophetic voices addressing the situation then and be comforted by them in our situation. Because the people of God, where we are now, we've been there before. We've been there before. We've been marginalized, under pressure, under the threat of total extinction, or we've been tempted to assimilate totally into the oppressing culture around us. That's what happened to the northern tribes in ancient Israel. They were simply wiped out 700 years before Christ. They totally assimilated into the surrounding culture. They did not stay faithful to the scripture reading and the covenant with their God. The synagogue was an invention in a crisis time like this, when you're at the rivers of Babylon, where you cannot sing the temple hymns and the processional songs that you used to sing when you went up to the center of that culture, where the temple was the accepted center in the culture. How can we sing the songs of Zion at the rivers of Babylon? where people believe all kind of mystical, superstitious, occult things, and where nothing in the structure of the culture supports our beliefs. They simply divided the people into families of 10, a synagogue called the Gathering, and they began to explore the scriptures, to seek for an answer, to mirror their situation in the scriptures. What is it that we are experiencing? And God raised the prophet Ezekiel. No. There was a songwriter. He actually said, that was his solution. Let's take the babies of our enemies and smash their heads on the ground. There's a song about that in the Old Testament. That's one way of reacting. Some Christians do that. They hate the culture. They become violent. They shoot people. The other solution is settle. Immerse yourself in that culture. Grow families. Get married. Have kids. Live a normal life. And bless the city. Pray for it. Have a blessing attitude. Show what it is to reflect a living God that can change lives. Be faithful in the covenant. I think they listened to Ezekiel. I know I have a future for you, the Lord says through him. A future of prosperity and hope, not a catastrophe. It seems as if the things that we think are the crisis or the enemy, like Boko Haram in Nigeria, pointing to small girls with school diplomas. That's what Boko Haram terrorists do. They point to 14-year-old girls with a diploma and say, that's the enemy. That's not very brave of these men. And sometimes we as Christians identify the wrong enemies. Actually, the enemies in our culture might be the opportunity that we have. We turn the challenge into an opportunity. I know it's a very bad comparison for some reason. So it's only true on one single point. Don't identify the wrong enemy. I think the culture as it is our chance for entering emergent leadership zone, but we just have to become missionaries. Just have to do that. And we have to learn the capacities and the skills and the habits of a missionary and a discipler. In the transition phase, it's time for prophetic revelation and correction to strategies that are not going to work. It's time to deal with our feelings of pain and loss and sorrow. But it's also time to reorient ourselves. To develop a new apostolic imagination. What is God calling us to? And begin to move into the green zone of missional experimenting once again. I only said 50% of what I prepared. That's typical. I would like, if we could go to the slide 7. I'll just give you, this was a tool, but also on the slide 7. Maybe 8. There it is, yes. What is your personal vision for you, your leaders, and your congregations in your context as of now? What is that? In these weeks and months, I work through this. Because I know in a time like this, it's not time to come up with some BHAGs, big, hairy, audacious goals or strategies. But it's about identifying at a very deep level, what is my vision? What is my vision? And vision is always based on your passion and your gifts as a leader. Your passion and your gifts. It's based on the passion of gifts of the members or of your team, your staff, or your congregation. But it also has to relate to the immediate context that you're in. And a lot of churches, they come up with a new vision as a solution to the crisis, and they wonder, why does it fail? Why does it fail? I think we live in times where we have to be very, very discerning. What is God saying to me? What is the passion that He's put down there? What are my gifts? And maybe you feel you're in a cage and you're so restrained by your job description or the model of how you're doing church or ministry models from the performative zone, but you're in the high red zone and you think about quitting, and you really should. Unless you go into the green emergent zone. I'm sure that a lot of self-identity problems, lack of passion, tiredness, senses of burnout, really is a matter of you haven't gotten out of the red zone into the green zone. And it's time to listen to what God has put down in you. I know, and it's time to listen to the people in your congregation. What are their dreams, aspirations? In my small church of 35 adults, I'm a part-time pastor there, I'm just taking some of the key people out for dinners as the new pastor, and I just try to find out what is their passion and what are their giftings. And when I come home, I add a little piece to my paper on the vision for this new church. And I see it's not about building a fantastic church. It's also about being a church. But it's more about how can we be the kind of church that releases people into their mission. So I'm having these kind of listening experiences. And like the stories I told you of the visitors to the church services, we have to interact with the culture around us, spend a lot of time talking to people, interacting with them, find out what are their needs. And I deeply believe that a vision that is based on your deepest passions and longings and your gifts so you could actually accomplish your vision. You have the energy to do it and you have the skills to do it. And if you don't have the skills, acquire them. Get training, get coaching. And also, if you see there are other churches in very similar context to your churches, go to that place and see what works. Look into their innovations. You don't have to innovate anything. I've never innovated anything, really. I just began traveling 12 years ago when I found out the model just creates transfer growth from other churches. But this, I thought I was called to be a missionary. And this kind of church just generates transfer growth. And the problem about that is they expect me to be their pastor. That was not my plan. My passion is to be a missionary. So I'm going to start almost all over. I will go home and read Leslie Newbegin. I'll get some missional training courses. That's what he taught in a missional college in Selly Oak in the 80s and the 90s. I'm going to read it, and I'm going to apply it. So why do I say this? I think this is a message if you are in a situation where you are striving, and this is a message of encouragement to actually process where you're at. So let's just have 5 minutes with the 3-zone leadership model, and let's turn to one another and share where you're at personally, as a congregation, as a movement. You might be in very different places, but maybe you would need maybe a couple of minutes, especially the introverts, just to process where you're at. You see my empathy, that you're already laughing. I was trying to accommodate the introverts, and now you already feel offended. As if I said something wrong, I feel it. Sorry. But please just spend a couple of minutes sharing where you're at. And we'll do some closing ministry time. Yes.